Hey, Ali. Thank you so much for coming to the Token Economy podcast.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's get right into it. So, why don't you introduce yourself and Bluvia to people who don't know you?
Yeah, sounds good. So, in case the accent didn't give it away, I'm British. I trained as a mathematician, but I also went to Cambridge to study biology. Um, and then in my early career, I worked in biotech. So, I joined as a fifth employee in early stage biotech, which we ended up taking public, called Atai. And then following that, I co founded my first company, Heading Health. Heading is a large venture backed interventional psychiatry player. We started it out in Austin. Um, and yeah, now I'm working on Bolivia.
Okay, very cool. So, what does Bluvia do? And then I have so many questions about your background. You have such a fascinating background.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. So, Bolivia Health, we are tackling the public health crisis, which is post surgical complications. These complications have a huge patient burden associated with them. But potentially more interesting to our customer, which is the hospital or the health system, they have a huge economic burden. In fact, they drain a third of all surgical revenue coming into a health system. So if you have a surgery department bringing in $100 million a year in revenue, $30 million a year goes straight to fighting complications. So it's a real huge drain when it comes to sort of economic leakage.
Okay, okay, very cool. So, let's first kind of go back in time. So, you're a mathematician, and somehow you landed as like this early stage employee at Atai, and especially in the UK in London, where not a lot of people one start companies or join companies. Talk to us a little bit about that, which is like, how do you make that decision, and what was Atai like? Just because you were so early, and the company, of course, like had a massive scale and grew really, really quickly.
Yeah. So the story was a sort of a twisted path. I um, originally wanted to go into finance. I wanted to be a quant. Um,
Of course.
but of course, but I ended up finding myself in a situation where I was surrounded by people who wanted to go into finance. And so the kind of contrarian in me kicked in. And I thought, hey, I need to try and find something else. Um, I started moonlighting at startups all the way through university. But my kind of frustration was that a lot of startups were doing sort of things that were incremental and not things that were paradigm shifting. And I know that's a really sort of high bar um, to ask for. But I was very lucky. I came across a company called Compass Pathways. So this is actually Priyatai. I was one of the first employees there. They were the first company to develop psychedelics for depression. They were based in London. They were backed by Teal, which was unheard of for a London-based company. Um, Ended up doing very well. They went public for $1 billion. And through moonlighting there as an intern, I met their investors who were starting a fund in Berlin. So I moved to Berlin, and that fund ended up sort of metaphor. It kind of merged into a biotech, and it became a biotech company, and then we took it public. So that's the story in a nutshell.
Okay, lots of twists and turns. That doesn't actually get us to Bluvia. So in the middle between RIA and then taking the company, of course, like public, in the middle you also started Heading Health, and that of course reached 10 million ARR and was venture funded. Talk to us a little bit about what happened there, which is like you were there for you were at RIA for a little bit, and then sounds like the founder bug caught in you, and you said, "Hey, like I want to go do my own thing." What clicked, and what was Heading Health all about?
Yeah. So when I was at Atai, so Atai was also developing psychedelics for depression. At the time, psychedelics were like the most exciting thing in the world. Like when we were at Atai, when we were a five-person company, we were on the front page of Reddit at some point. It felt like just the most exciting thing in the world and the most potentially paradigm shifting thing in the world. There was a lot of hype around it. One of the main issues that the leadership team at Atai were thinking about, and a lot of the investors in Atai were thinking about, was if you get these psychedelics approved by the FDA, how are you actually going to get them to patients at scale? Because they're dissociative compounds. And And there is not existing infrastructure set up in the US or anywhere that can deliver these kinds of treatments. Um, and so I thought, so this was in 2019. So in 2019, Johnson and Johnson got a new drug approved called Spravato, which is intranasal ketamine, and Wall Street were really excited about it. But the big bottleneck for ketamine was the same as psychedelics. They just didn't really have the delivery infrastructure. So we, you know, basically thought, why don't we use ketamine as a proof of concept, build out a kind of care delivery model around Spravato, the ketamine drug, and then when psychedelics are approved down the line, we'll become the scaled provider of psychedelics.
Mhm.
I pitched this at Atai internally, but Atai was busy with the IPO, and there were biotech companies who actually can't own the delivery of your own drugs. There's a sort of an incentive issue there. So I found a co-founder, Simon, who's still running the ship and has scaled it to 25 million ARR roughly. So
Wow.
he's still going.
Yeah.
Um, and and yeah, we started it off. We started in March 2020, which was a really interesting time to start a company.
Yeah, it was a very interesting time to start a company, and sounds like you're still on the train, of course, like building in healthcare, and now you're, of course, building Bluvia around surgical complications. As somebody who's, of course, like a serial founder who's seen this journey multiple times at different companies, what about the problem of surgical complications was urgent enough that you felt like dedicating, I guess, your next and potentially the last company you build for the next couple of decades to this problem?
Yeah, so when I was ideating, I have a healthcare bias. So I'm always interested in. I actually have specifically a biotech bias because Atai was a biotech company, and I have a lot of passion for the space. And in biotech, what you're looking for is areas of patient unmet need, basically underserved areas where patients are either really sick, maybe with oncology or immunology or whatever, where they're not being served by current standard of care. So that's kind of the lens to which I see the world. And I had an uncle a few years ago who had a really devastating post-surgical complication that actually still affects him to this day. And so when I remembered that, I started digging around in the space. Um, and it turns out it's a huge, huge prevalent issue. 1 in 5 patients experiences surgical complications. So 1 in 5 people who undergo surgery get a complication. And according to the literature, at least half of complications are avoidable. So that just tells me, it's an underserved area of patient need.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And as you think about the actual product of how to solve the problem, talk to us a little bit about what Bluvia is actually building in terms of a product, and how do you actually solve this issue for the hospital systems?
Yeah. So we spoke to probably around 50 health systems covering 300 hospitals in the US to understand what they're already doing, what hasn't worked in the past. We also spoke to clinicians on the floor to understand why are 50% of complications avoidable. And what we learned is that um, physicians are thinly staffed in the ward. Often they are handed over the ward, maybe they're on a night shift, and so they've been given the ward with little context. And so when a patient gets a complication, they deteriorate exponentially, and the intervention is often not timely or mismanaged. And
Mhm.
it's no fault of the clinician. They're dealing with 20, 30 patients on the ward. Um, 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 and every patient has a unique medical history. So it's very difficult to provide that kind of personalized care in the ward. And as
Yeah.
a result, the ward, like a lot of healthcare, is a reactive system. And so our solution is really focused around how to optimize intervention, both from a timeliness perspective and also which intervention is the best for the specific patient.
Okay. And is it the doctor who uses the system? Sound like this is like a software system that kind of helps provide recommendations based upon the data that you have on the patient, and a bunch of different things. Or is it the nurse? Like who ends up interacting with it? And do you integrate with the EHR system? Like how does that work?
Yeah, great question. So the way we're coming into the health system is actually through quite a low friction entry point, which is it sounds slightly different, but the underlying tech is extremely similar. So the first line of defense for complications are quality teams. Quality, every hospital has a quality team, and a quality team spends about 10% of their time working on proactive quality initiatives to try and reduce complications. They spend 90% of their time going through old cases, so the last 30 days of patient cases, and it's usually a nurse who will read all the messy EHR data for a patient and try and understand if a complication happened. Was it escalated in time? Was it an instance of failure to rescue? What they're doing is they're actually just it's phenotype classification. They're
Yeah,
labeling the data.
yeah,
And so that's what we're starting off with. It's almost like a workflow automation piece, but it provides the phenotypes and the foundation for us to then run that same model prospectively in the ward. And so that's when we start suggesting to interventions to clinicians in real time.
Okay, and talk to us about this recommendation system of like how do you actually come up with that? Sounds like are you building on top of current AI models? Are you training your own model? Like how what is kind of the secret sauce behind the recommendation system, which of course like drives a lot of the efficiency here?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, so we start with the phenotype classification, and then what we do is we do root cause analysis. So we try and understand causal links um, for if a patient gets a complication, what may have caused that in their background, or was it an issue with the provider instead of the patient-specific risk factors. Um, and this is how we kind of start to understand um, kind of the temporality of it all, the cause of it all. The model we're using is not an LLM specifically, it's an LLM harnessed with classic ML. And the reason is because a huge component of this is temporality. So if you go to med school and you go to the post-surgical complication class, things are taught on a time axis. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, the deterioration is exponential. And so we need to use classic ML techniques to kind of understand the right time to intervene. The other thing I do want to mention is we're not just forecasting patient deterioration, we're also understanding what interventions work for which patients and then measuring the outcomes. And so we're building a kind of flywheel to understand exactly how to optimize care.
Okay, that's really fascinating. You've secured this partnership with the Mayo Clinic, which of course I don't have to say is a huge deal. Talk to us a little bit about how this partnership came along. What does the relationship look like, and what does this unlock for you and for Bluvia?
Yeah, it's a great way. We're very lucky to be partnered with them. The way it happened was very serendipitous in a way. Um, we, I was very early in my journey, and someone gave me a um, unconventional advice, which was instead of so the classic outreach is, tell someone what you're doing, tell someone what you need, and just fire out the emails cold and hope someone replies.
Yeah,
Um,
lots of hope and prayers.
lots of hope and prayers. In this case, someone suggested write a whole paragraphs about why you're doing this. You know, talk about your uncle and how you stumbled across this and why you want to solve this, and fire it out and see if it resonates with someone. And so I fired it out to about 35 health system execs, and no one replied except for the director of innovation at Mayo Clinic.
Except one of the
Um,
most important ones.
yeah, exactly. And so he said, okay, I'll give you a 20-minute call. We jump on a call. I pitched him this idea, and he interrupted me halfway through the pitch. And he said, Ali, I got to stop you for a second. This is in the top 5 best presentations I've ever seen. I don't know if he says that to everyone or not, but he ended up championing us through. And so what the partnership looks like today is a data partnership, and we're working closely with their clinical teams to get product feedback.
Okay, okay, and the data is of course key to training large models, not just LLMs, but the model that you're talking about, which is like traditional ML models, and kind of just like to produce better recommendations. It feels like we're kind of in this like we're in the AI era where so many people are just building wrapper companies, which is just takes a model, build some UI on top of it, and then like basically let the customer interact with that product, with the model and the intelligence through some sort of a UI. But clearly, there are two pieces in the healthcare ecosystem. One is you actually have to build for healthcare, and like there's so much work that goes into actually integrating with these hospital systems. But then along with that, there's also like the recommendations, which clearly, like, because of the data advantage, sounds like there's a real moat that you're building around it. So talk to us a little bit about that, the data moat, and like how this data enables you to kind of build a much more long duration moat versus any other person who wants to start a similar recommendation, or basically a similar company for surgical complications.
Yeah. So our thesis in clinical AI is that your phone chess app will crush an LLM at chess because it's been trained for a specific use case. And so we think in clinical AI, the same kind of phenomena will emerge, which is you'll need to train specific AIs for specific use cases. LLMs are really great at certain things, but they kind of fall short in certain areas as well. Um, in terms of the moat, we have access to a lot of data, which is great. The initial moat is around um, turning that into the phenotypes. And phenotyping, and that sounds straightforward, but it's non-trivial, particularly for rare complication types, for example. And what you want to do is you want to benchmark your accuracy against a clinician. So there's quite a high bar there. And that's why we've hired a doctor in-house actually to help us fine-tune our model. The other moat, or the other really important consideration, is workflow. And prediction alone is not going to solve the problem. Our belief is you need to go surgical line by surgical line. Each surgical line has a different workflow, and embed the model and the actions in the specific surgical lines. So it's both a moat because you have to be quite kind of forward deployed, but also it's not as horizontal, for example, as a sort of generalized LLM.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like everybody loves talking about the model, but then the other piece that we were just talking about, which is actually integrating with these healthcare systems and actually getting the real product inside the hospital. As somebody who's worked in healthcare for a very long time, you probably are very familiar, and you should teach us what does it take for something to be like this recommendation system, or this for this product to actually get implemented inside the healthcare system. Like, talk to us about like what is needed, because it feels like that the product gets you kind of 50% of the way there in these highly regulated industries like healthcare. What is that rest 50%, or if it's even higher? You're the best person to tell us.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think um, there's no way around it. A forward deployed model is what's needed to get things done in a health system. As I mentioned, it's both a moat, and once you set up these sort of modules, it's extremely scalable. That you basically charge and you have ARR in the future once you've done your deployment. Um, what the implementation looks like is it's a bit custom in the sense that every hospital has tweaks on a workflow. So a colorectal surgery, there are some similarities, but some differences site to site. And every hospital has a different EHR mix as well. The EHR component is not as challenging because of EHR interoperability reforms. So post 2023, we now have access to EHR data, which is fantastic. Um, I think the real challenge is change management friction
Hmm.
of clinical staff. If you change the workflow in any way, resistance. Um, our sort of belief around this is, number one, you need a really strong clinical champion to help kind of push your your solution internally. There's a lot of sort of people dynamics basically when you get on the ground. Um, and the other thing is we're trying to build it in such a way that we start with something simple. I mentioned that sort of nurse inference abstraction piece, the retrospective module. We start with something simple, and then we want to grow into sort of things that require more change management, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting you mentioned the change management piece because it feels like kind of all companies deal with that. Why in sort of a broader question more around healthcare AI and just healthcare systems, which is like healthcare is clearly this like massive multi-trillion dollar opportunity globally. Let's just to talk about the US, still pretty massive. It feels like we see the least amount of innovation in healthcare, even the healthcare potential, like you mentioned, which is it's so personal. Almost everybody has it, everybody's impacted by it, everybody has a story, but it feels like this is the slowest moving sector when it comes to real innovation. Do you think it's that change management piece that really drives so much inertia, or what is your view of why there is slower innovation in healthcare?
That's a great question. I think there's a few reasons. One is health systems are operating on very thin margins, so there's very small room for error. And so that's why when you come with any solution, having a very, very crisp ROI story is really important. That's point number one. Point number two, I want to say a high stakes environment, but I find that a very generic point. I think point number three is the fact that clinicians are um, are doing their best, but are often like the average doctor or the average nurse is cognitively fatigued. I think that's a huge component. So getting them who are doing such great work to change their workflow in any way is an uphill battle. The fourth thing I think is actually really interesting is misaligned incentives.
Interesting.
So yeah,
What exactly?
misaligned incentives. I like patient mortality is not like a KPI that hospitals track. Or
Yeah.
maybe they track it, but they don't. It's not a core KPI.
Yeah.
A core KPI would be something like a readmission or a length of stay. Core KPIs are basically attached to reimbursement.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so if you come in with a solution that like saves lives, that is not a crisp ROI story.
Interesting.
You need a solution that aligns all the different stakeholder incentives within the hospital, in the language of the hospital, that ties in with the specific reimbursement of a surgery, which may be under a VBC agreement, not a fee for service agreement. It's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. No, clearly, and the incentive misalignment piece is so interesting because it's totally true, which is like people only solve for the KPIs where they think, I mean, like hospitals are businesses too. They're of course like trying to solve for higher reimbursements, higher revenue growth every year. And the fact that patient mortality is not this one core KPI that kind of holistically hospital systems are thinking as actively about, or just given there's no real incentive towards it. It's so fascinating because nobody, like everybody, of course, like you go on the ground and people are trying to save lives, and it's very true. But along with that, it's kind of from a holistic level, there's no clear motivation around it.
I think it's not, yeah, and it's not malicious on the hospital
Yeah,
side.
exactly.
It's a function of the fact that hospitals are in a very tricky spot. They have regulated revenue and unregulated cost base, which squeezes that margin to razor thin.
That is
Um,
so interesting because you're totally right, which is Medicare, Medicaid, regulated revenue, which is capped and lots of paperwork attached to getting any of those pieces. But then when it comes to actual expenses, break down kind of like what does that unregulated expense look like, and like what are hospitals more scared of on that end, because it feels like we all think a lot about reimbursements, but not as much about like healthcare systems and their expenses.
yeah, the expenses are, everyone talks about the huge administrative burden. Now that's, um, all the clinicians, all the coding, all the revenue cycle management. That's a huge component of it. Um, Another component of it is um, just everything's expensive in healthcare. All the this won't flow through your P&L, but like all the machinery that you have, um, uh, doctor salaries are really high. Doctor salaries are high because med school is expensive. All the costs are sky high, and so you have, and as I mentioned, you pair that up with a regulated revenue stream, and you really just squeeze the margins. And so, um, I think there is a moral imperative to for someone, whether it's Blueview or someone else, to try and bend the cost curve um, because otherwise the future doesn't look fantastic for providers. Basically, you've got Medicaid cuts looming as well, which are only going to make matters worse.
Yeah, yeah. And to talk about the pieces that actually help increase adoption, one of the big pieces that you mentioned, of course, is reliability and accuracy. And like between traditional ML models and of course like next generation kind of LM multimodal models, there's still a fair like these models have gotten really good. There's lots of intelligence. They're probably better than most of us imagined they would be today, but still there are hallucinations. And so, how do you think about reliability, accessibility, and guardrails in the healthcare context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what resonates well for medical and clinical audiences are number one, just building something without overclaiming what it can do. This is something that's quite interesting, I think, in healthcare, is when you're doing sales in other areas, it's kind of good to paint a big picture of what you could potentially do.
Overpromise, yes.
Yeah, in healthcare, uh, that you should do the opposite. I really think that. I really think that trust is so important. Um, um, just given that you're dealing with the sort of high stakes environment. Um, the other thing that resonates quite well is publishing. I think publishing is really interesting. This is one of the parallels I bring from biotech, where if you run a clinical study, you usually publish that, get it peer reviewed, and I think that's something else that resonates a lot when selling it to health systems.
Okay, okay. And we were just talking about KPIs. What is so you're kind of starting, of course, with this slice, which makes a lot of sense, just given almost all of the inertia we've talked about in the healthcare systems, which is you have to be really precise and you go after this a niche problem and then kind of grow from there and not to see real adoption. What is the big vision for Bluvia? Like, what does Bluvia look like in 10 years? And how do you define success?
Hmm. I think for us, I've kind of alluded to it already. I think my belief is that the ROI on being a doctor is the worst it's ever been. A lot of doctors I know, sure, there's a huge selection bias here, but they are thinking of leaving medicine or have left medicine, and so clinical AI is going to kind of augment that as we see that shift happening. Um, our goal for Bluvia is basically to be an AI co-pilot in the ward, um, and basically help enhance decision making for nurses and doctors when the ward is thinly staffed, so that patients don't slip through the cracks.
That's a huge vision. And it's so fascinating because you're of course in healthcare, and then your co-founders your co-founder of course comes from more of a traditional background. Talk to us. We didn't really end up covering a lot about in the introduction, a little bit about your team and how you met your co-founder. Tell us that story too, because to go after this big vision you need one, lots of healthcare experience, but also you also need a lot of really technical engineers and engineering experience to build these recommendation systems, to build the product, the UI, all of those pieces. So talk to us a little bit about how do you meet your co-founder and what is required to build. I guess like or what are the learnings that your co-founder has brought from his experience at Twitter and the ML team there?
It's a great question. I think when I was doing my co-founder search, I um, I remember burning every card I had with everyone I knew because I thought this is
What a
a
great phrase to use.
yeah. I was, I feel like I knew a lot of people in a lot of places, and I said to all of them, really bat for me here. Try and find me someone great, because the plan is to start a company with them for a long time. Um, and so, for example, I had a friend, Iris, who emailed like 5,000 Stanford alumni from her alumni account to help me find someone. I built this amazing pipeline of
That's such a
talent.
good story.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to her. And then I started thinking about what am I optimizing for here? Is it technical ability? And what I figured was I'm optimizing for problem solving. And the reason is because um, this problem that we're trying to solve is a large structural one. It's not one that requires, you know, hiring a lot of engineers really quickly. It requires a lot of thinking outside the box. When it comes to change management, when it comes to tricky integrations, when it comes to long sales cycles, there's a lot of challenging components of this business. And so when I came across Abide, the person who introduced me to him told me that when he was at Yelp, he won every single hackathon at Yelp 3 years in a row, and no one else won a hackathon. And I was like, that's kind of cool.
Way to
Um,
crush it. Way to crush
yeah,
morale.
yeah, yeah. And then I thought, well, um, um, I think things became apparent. It was more a leap of faith. I don't believe in love and first sight when you match up with someone. But I think over time, I started to realize, wow, he's a really great problem solver. Um, so, so yeah, that's the
And
story.
and on the co-founder search piece and co-founder matching, because it's so unique, because clearly you came from a background where you knew lots of people, but you still end up going outside of your network and looking for somebody, and then of course like going through almost this matchmaking process of, is this the right person or not, and then kind of churning through people to figure out who is the right person. We both are in Silicon Valley. We come across lots of people who are kind of going through this journey of, should I start a company? Who is the right person to start the company with? You were clearly looking for somebody who's a problem solver. Somebody. And what is your advice for founders who are in that process, which is either thinking about starting a company, thinking about trying to figure out who the right co-founder is? Like, what is the right mental model to think about those things? Just because you're totally right, it feels like a marriage. This is something you're going to do for a very long time. So give us kind of what were your biggest learnings from this whole process?
Yeah, I think this is one of the toughest things in starting a company is finding the right person. Um, what would I say here? I would say I would say, okay, a few things. Number one, which I think is an interesting one, maybe it's a bit controversial, but um, I think it's always good to be in a like high leverage position. And what that means in this dynamic is almost that you could start and do the company by yourself and would need someone to complement you ideally, as opposed to being super reliant on someone just helping you out. I think coming from a position of strength is really helpful. Um, I think the rest is just trying to see if they have the soft skills, and that's where the compatibility comes in. For me, it's all about over communicating. I think the reason me and my co-founder have never had an argument is we over communicate everything. We have really difficult conversations. We had them really early on. I think that's been really helpful. Um, but advice generally is go with your gut. I don't know. Go with
Hey,
your gut. I
that's
don't
very fair. Yes,
know.
yes, totally. and
Potentially.
and it's so interesting, right? Because there's no real answer. There's no right answer, really, and you won't know for a very, like, until you get to those really tough conversations. And you're totally right, which is what I've noticed from the company that I started a very long time ago, and then along with that from friends who start companies, is the best founding teams have tough conversations all the time, which is the whole point. Which is the whole point of having a team, is the fact that you have the ability to actually discuss and work through these problems with those teams and with individuals who have differentiated perspectives and are true problem solvers, which I totally agree is kind of one of the key things you should look for in a co-founder. One broad-based kind of healthcare AI question, we kind of discussed some of the inertia that there is, but then it feels like there's also so much opportunity inside of healthcare. You're of course like tackling one piece of it. What are other spaces that you're very excited about inside of healthcare that you feel like there should be companies to be built? Yeah, what are spaces you're most excited about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I think there's a lot of opportunity on the pharma side. Um, I think farmers are very pharmaceutical companies are very different to health systems. They have amazing margins. They have huge cash on their balance sheet. Um, there's some dynamics which are extremely favorable to vendors. For example, if you can, um, okay, so the way pharma works is you have a drug that when it sells, it makes, if it's a blockbuster, $1 billion a year, there's a fixed patent life. And so if you can speed up a clinical trial, you have that leverage on the other side because it's you're I'm not describing it very well, but it has a fixed amount of time, and then if you can kind of expand that by even a little bit, that's a big lever basically.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of favorable dynamics in pharma when it comes to clinical trials.
And is
Um,
that when you say pharma, do you mean companies like Isomorphic and others, which are kind of trying to do drug discovery with AI, or do you mean, or are you referencing something else? And I guess we'd also love to get your views on just AI driven drug discovery, just because it feels like that feels very close to what you're talking about.
Yeah. So for me, it's more on the rest of the R&D. I think
Uh-huh.
that's quite interesting that there's been so much AI concentrated on the discovery side and not as much on the rest of the 5-year cycle of R&D before launching a product.
Yeah.
Um, I know that's a bit vague. I think on the discovery side, it's been really interesting watching that space unfold. You started off with companies like benevolent AI, which were doing like drug repurposing, going through massive libraries of data, and sort of then that evolved into sort of discovering novel, so NCEs, novel chemical entities, exscientia, and then that kind of moved into the sort of protein folding space, isomorphic labs you mentioned. When I was at Atai, we did a really interesting deal actually with a company called Cyclica, which I think, but I might be wrong, got bought by Recursion, which I think merged into Exscientia.
Oh
And
wow.
so I think, don't quote me on that, but potentially. And so what we did was, this is actually one of the coolest things I've done. So there was a I'm about to go on a massive tangent. There was a biochemist in,
Uh, the floor is all yours.
perfect. So there was someone called Alexander Shulgin. I think he was in the 60s. He was a biochemist who basically made a lot of money by inventing like a new fertilizer for a big chemicals company. And they gave him a fully funded lab and they said, do whatever you want. And so this was before Controlled Substances Act, so before psychedelics became illegal. He basically spent his entire time manipulating chemical structures of classic psychedelics to come up with novel psychedelics that had different properties, different experiential properties. And so he wrote a book, Tikal, and another book called Pikal. And basically, um, these books are chemical synthesis of all the different psychedelic entities that he discovered, and also his experience on them. And they all have different sort of experiences when you ingest them. What we did with Cyclica at Atai was we thought, hey, why not try and discover new psychedelics by using AI to manipulate and find all the different permutations of the chemical structures. And so we did a joint venture with them. Um, However, what actually ended up happening is that Shulgin, in his lifetime, I think he developed hundreds of new psychedelics, and he basically exhausted the catalog. So even with AI, I don't think we came up with anything novel, but it was worth a try.
You know, so interesting and fascinating. We've covered so much ground. My last question to you is just, what is your wild prediction for 2026? This is kind of the last question we ask every guest who's on the podcast.
Hmm. I think it's. I'm going to cop out. It's not a prediction, but it's a trend
Okay.
that I think is just worth noting. but it's amazing to me just how many people use ChatGPT for their health. Um, I think it's funny because in the health world, people are scared of using AI in a health context, but every day people are using AI in a health context for their personal health. And so I think that's only going to proliferate. And I think, yeah, open evidence is a great case study as well on how, LLMs have transformed sort of clinical guidance. And so, yeah, I think that's gonna continue, and I'm keen to see how that unfolds with regulation and how it potentially impacts primary care and things like that.
Yeah, and on the OpenAI piece and people using ChatGPT, it almost feels like from everybody I talk to, which is you're totally right to say that there's inertia to even go to the healthcare system and then get an appointment, and then you are one patient amongst 20 that the clinician, the doctor, the nurse has to go through. And really, rather than going on in Google, you just go to ChatGPT and you say, hey, to the best of your knowledge, is this what I have, or these are my symptoms? Tell me tell me what I could have. And I guess now you don't get the inflammatory. You have some crazy X disease. You get something a little bit more reasonable. So it sounds like people are leaning towards at least getting some basic advice before they have to go to the emergency room or rush to a doctor, just because it feels like, at least in the American healthcare system, it's not, you can't walk into a doctor's office tomorrow if and you have to set up an appointment. There just feels like there's more friction. And all of this to say that I think it is those pieces that have led people to using ChatGPT. Sam always talks about how ChatGPT might become kind of your personal assistant for all things. And it's funny you mentioned this because not a lot of people think about healthcare, but I feel like Apple has started to make strides with the smartwatch to be more healthcare focused. And you're totally right, which is if ChatGPT interacts with your healthcare data and has access to your healthcare data, it can probably, with some the right guardrails and regulations, also become your personal assistant that knows everything about your health and tells you what becomes your nutritionist and becomes your gym coach and becomes and gives you some sort of basic, or I mean, over the long term also becomes your AI doctor.
On this topic, I think something this I guess is a bit controversial, but what doctors do is basically follow clinical guidelines. Now, some of these guidelines are really complex and it's very subjective on the edge cases, and you need specialists. Um, but something like asthma that hasn't really had a lot of innovation, the guidelines are pretty straightforward. Um, where I think healthcare has fallen short, in my opinion, is a doctor doesn't have the ability to look at your specific background, your specific symptoms, and go through and say, hey, this looks exactly like a patient I saw 5 years ago. And let me give you what worked for them. And that's personalized medicine. And so I think, where am I going with this? Yeah, I think AI has the ability to basically um, kind of do things
Unlock
that,
personalized medicine,
unlike person,
which
yeah, basically.
which would be which is such a grand vision, and it feels like is the promise that comes with healthcare and AI. And this conversation is so interesting because we touch so many of these topics, but totally it feels like that's the promise. And hopefully we're headed towards promised land. But Ali, it was so great having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. Yeah, nice. Thanks so much for having me.